In this video, I'm going to introduce you to Chapter 8, which focuses on markups. So I'll go over the basic markup formula, and you'll also learn how to compute markup variables when you know that the markup is based on cost or if it's based on selling price. And so we're also going to calculate markup percents based on costs and selling price. Okay, so the steps to computing the selling price, if it's based on cost, is to first multiply the cost by the markup percent, which will give you the dollar markup. Okay, and so this formula that you can use here is M equals C for cost times, and I just do M with a percent symbol. So that's how you calculate the dollar markup or your markup amount. To get the selling price, and I just use S for selling price, that's the markup amount, M, plus cost. And so here's an example. So using a markup based on cost, what are the dollar markup and selling price for something that costs $60 and has a 35% markup? And so recall that we're looking at all of these from a business point of view. So when we say costs, we're talking about what it costs the retailer to purchase it from a manufacturer. So let's say Target buys something from their wholesaler. What Target purchases at is their cost. Their selling price is the price that you and I have to pay as consumers. Okay, so the first step, of course, is to calculate your dollar markup. And in this case, we multiply 35% by $60, which gives us $21 as our dollar markup. The selling price is simply the dollar markup plus the cost. Okay, so all of this tells me is that if something costs a retailer $60, they're going to mark it up 35%, and 35% of $60 is $21. After that markup amount, they're going to sell it to you and I for $81. And let's say that we have an item that costs $1,240. That retailer marks it up by 40%. We're going to first find the dollar markup and then the selling price. So I'm going to take 1,240 times 40%, and this gives me a dollar markup amount of $496. Okay, and remember that formula to find your dollar markup. M is simply your markup percent plus your cost. Okay, so all we did was plug these values into this formula. To calculate your selling price, remember that formula is S equals your markup amount plus your cost. So using this formula, again, we're just plugging in what we know. That's $496 plus the cost of $1,240. And this gives me a selling price of $1,736. Okay, another thing we can do is to compute the selling price directly from the cost. And to do that, you'll first need to add the markup percent to 100%. Okay, so to calculate 100% plus markup percent, we're just adding those two together. And the second step is to multiply that sum by the cost to get the selling price. So in this example, we have a large camping tent that has a cost of $250 and a markup percent of 40% based on cost. So first, we just add 100% plus the markup percent. In this case, that gives us 140%. The selling price is what we got in step 1 times the cost. So 140% times $250 gives us a selling price of $350. Okay, and so let's see here, we have a cost of an item is $330. Okay, so C equals 330. My markup percent is 50%. So step 1 is to find 100% plus the markup percent. So I'll simply take 100% and add the markup percent of 50%, which gives me 150%. To calculate the selling price directly, I'll take that 150% and multiply that by the cost. So times 330. And this is going to give a selling price of $495. Okay, so if something costs a retailer $330 and they mark it up by 50%, they're going to sell it to us for $495. Okay, and this one we're going to compute the cost directly from the selling price. So step 1 is to add the markup percent to 100. So that's markup percent plus 100% is step 1. Step 2 is to divide the selling price by this sum to get the cost. And so let's see an example of this. Okay, so here it says the selling price of a hiking vest is $65. The markup percent based on cost is 30%. To find the cost, we're first adding 100% plus the markup percent, which gives us, in this case, 130%. And the cost is the selling price of $65 divided by 130%. Okay, so let's do this together. Let's say that we have a selling price of $780 with a markup percent of 25%. We're first going to find 100% plus the markup percent, which gives me 125%. Okay, to calculate the cost, what I'm going to do is to take the selling price of $780 and put that over 125%. Okay, and this is going to give me a cost of $624. Okay, another thing we can do is to compute the markup percent. So this time we're going to look for percents based on the cost. And step 1 is to calculate the dollar markup. Okay, and so the dollar markup can be noted with an M, and that's the selling price minus the cost. Okay, step 2 is to divide the dollar markup by the cost to get the markup percent. So that formula is M over C. And so in this example, it says, what is the markup percent based on cost when the selling price of an exercise machine is $480 and the cost is $320? So the first step is to calculate the dollar markup. $480 minus 320 is $160. So there is a $160 markup. To calculate the markup percent, I'm taking that dollar markup of 160, dividing that by 320, which gives me a 50% markup. Let's say that we have an item that costs $1,600 and a selling price of $2,560. To find the markup percent based on cost, remember the first step is to figure out what M is, the markup amount. And M is our selling price minus cost. So plugging that in, this tells me that 2,560 minus $1,600 is going to be my cost. And this happens to be $960. Okay, and so this was my dollar markup. Okay, step 2 is to calculate the markup percent. Remember, your markup percent is your dollar markup, and then because this is based on cost, it's going to be over C for cost. So plugging in what we know, this becomes $960 over the cost of $1,600. This gives me 0.60, which is equivalent to 60%. Okay, so there's a 60% markup. Now we're going to compute the cost based on selling price. And so the steps for this is to find the dollar markup. So M equals your selling price times the markup percent. Then step 2 is to subtract the dollar markup for the selling price to get the cost. So that means that C equals S minus M. And then in this example, we have Rosa who enters an appliance store to buy a washing machine. She finds one with a selling price of $400, but she knows she can buy it for $375 at another store. But she prefers the store because of its reputation. And so she would buy it for $375. And Mike knows that the markup percent is 40% based on selling price. So based on $400, what was Mike's cost for the washing machine? So the store owner who's selling it for $400. To calculate the dollar markup, I'm multiplying the markup percent by the selling price. That gives me a $160 markup amount. And then the cost is the selling price of $400 minus the dollar markup amount, which gives me a cost of $240. So Mike's purchasing the washing machine from the wholesaler for $240, and then he's then reselling it to the consumers for $240. Okay, in this example, we have a selling price of $750 and a markup percent of 50%. We're going to find the dollar markup and then the cost. Okay, so the markup amount, remember, is your markup percent times your selling price. Okay, and if we plug that in, that becomes 50% times $750, which gives me a markup amount of $375. Now that we have the markup amount, can calculate the cost. And so your cost, or C, is your selling price minus the markup amount. Okay, so that is $750 minus the markup amount of $375, and this gives me a cost of $375. So in this instance, the dollar markup and the cost were both $375. Okay, another thing we can do is to compute the cost directly from the selling price. Okay, so what you're going to do is to subtract the markup percent from 100%. So that's simply 100% minus the markup percent. And then the second step is going to be to multiply this difference by selling the price to get the cost. Okay, and in this example, we have the cost of a clothes dryer has a selling price of $340 and a markup percent of 60% based on selling price. So what's the cost of that? First step is to subtract the markup percent from 100%. That gives us 40%. And then the cost is at 40% times the selling price. In this case, it's $136. Okay, so here we have a selling price of $40, and we have a markup percent of 30%. And you can think about the first step as it relates to last week when we were looking at complements. The complements was 100% minus whatever discount we had last week. In this case, I have 70%, and then that means my cost is going to be 70% times my selling price. Okay, so 70% times 40 gives me a cost of $28. So if something originally cost a retailer $28 to purchase and they mark it up 70%, that's going to end up being $40 as the price that they sell it for. Okay, there's a few more examples here. In this one, we're going to compute the selling price directly from the cost. The first step is to subtract the markup percent from 100%. So 100% minus markup percent. The second step is to divide the cost by that difference to get the selling price. Okay, and so let's say that the cost of a new mountain bike is $210. The markup percent based on the selling price is 40%, and we want to find the selling price. So the first step is to find that complement. So 100% minus the markup percent of 40% gives us 60%. And the selling price is then going to be the cost of $210 divided by 60%, which gives us a selling price of $350. Okay, and so again, we have the cost here of $150. Markup percent is 40%. The first thing we're going to do is to find 100% minus the markup percent, which is 40%. That complement is 60%. Now that I have this 60%, I can take the cost of $150 over 60%, and this is going to give me $250. Okay, so that's my selling price. So an item that costs $150, which is marked up 40%, is going to be sold for $250. Now we're going to look at steps to compute the markup percent from the selling price. The first step is to subtract the cost from the selling price to get the dollar markup. So this is really easy. M equals S minus C. The second step is to divide the dollar markup by the selling price. So M over S will give me the markup percent. Okay, so what is the markup percent based on selling price when the selling price is $80 and the cost is $50? So again, the dollar markup is simply the selling price of $80 minus the cost of $50. And so that tells me that this item was marked up $30. To calculate the percent, we're taking that dollar markup of $30 and putting that over the selling price of $80. That's going to give me 37.5%. And for this one, it gives us the cost and selling price, and it's telling us to find the markup percent based on selling price. And although it didn't say to calculate the dollar markup, you need to find the dollar markup before you can calculate the percent. Okay, and remember that your markup is going to be your selling price minus your costs. So plugging these in, I have 2,560 minus 1,600. This gives me a markup amount of $960. And my markup percent is my markup amount of $960 over, and because this is markup percent based on selling price, from this keyword selling price here, I know that the selling price needs to be my denominator. If it were markup percent based on cost, you would put the cost as your denominator. So just be aware when you're doing that. And so this happens to be 0.375, which is also equivalent to 37.5%. And so that's going to be it for this introduction video. I think Chapter 8 is a relatively easy chapter for you to grasp. I think maybe the only difficult part would be remembering which formulas to use. So make sure that you read carefully the Chapter 8 and the e-text.